but I think it's all relevant to indigenous issues as well. Next slide. And oh, keep clicking. Okay. What is ethical water management? What I mean by that is water management that's guided by stakeholder values. And what if their values are not very ethical, like that's the problem we have in politics all the time. So it's not really a matter of we don't have to judge whether the values are ethical or not. But to me, the main thing is that the values are a result of reflecting on the goodness or badness of those ethics. So it's like what everybody has to do. That's due diligence in the water ethics world. Is you can't rely on somebody else to tell you what's ethical. You have to figure it out for yourself. Next, click. And why focus on values? Because values motivate behavior. Our behavior needs to change. And laws are not enough to do it. Laws are based on values, but there's again, politics in the US is a great example. You can't depend on the values to guarantee ethical behavior. You need ethics for ethical behavior. And we need to work on our values first. And how do we do that? How do we work with values? It's, I think, a mapping process, first of all, identifying the range of community values about water, and then starts the kind of sticky stuff of consensus building approaches to harmonize conflicting positions, negotiation, mediation, articulating practical codes of water ethics at multiple levels, local, municipal, basin, national, global. I'm not going to get into those things, but I just want to really stay on the kind of the surface of what water ethics means to me and what I think it can mean to transboundary water management. Next slide. Next slide, I'm going to skip this one. Too complicated. Ethics is a complement to law, and laws are based on ethics, on somebody's concept of ethics. But laws are always a little bit behind. Ethics provides a more flexible approach because they don't have any teeth. Ethics laws may or may not have teeth depending on what kind of law it is. But ethics almost never has teeth, and which makes them weaker but also more versatile. Next slide. Where do the ethics come from, or where do our values come from with regard to water ethics? And I'm going to spend some time on this slide. There's an I call it intellectual context. I could also call it the values context of water ethics. IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management, is itself a big basket full of normative values about stakeholder participation, the gender roles, sustainability. And then we have nexus approaches that integrate the integrated water resources management is an integration of something that's already integrated. And we need that. So there's a lot that's already out there. You don't really need somebody like me saying these are water ethics, but I'm more of a compiler of ethics. One good place to look for ethics is the Sustainable Development Goals, which are well thought out, wide-ranging, and most importantly, they show the interactions among different values, environmental values and economic values, for example. Water integrity is a concept that's been very well worked out by Transparency International that has 3 parts: TAP, transparency, accountability, and participation. Water stewardship is kind of the ethical response of industry and business. There's an Alliance for Water Stewardship that publishes, I think they're in their 2nd edition of the Water Stewardship Standard, which is basically guidelines to what stewardship around water means to them. And you can get a certification and a logo saying that your business is in compliance with best practices. The Rights of Nature movement, the Commons movement, that water is a commons, is not just a claim, an assertion, it's also a description that when the aquifer is contaminated, everybody suffers. That's the nature of a commons. And water justice is the term that's used by the World Council of Churches in their ecumenical water network. The OECD has spent a lot of effort developing governance principles, water governance principles. And here's the tribal part. Cultural diversity, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a very powerful document that has great values from which we can derive ethics in supporting the traditional lifeways of Indigenous peoples if that's the way they want to go. Next slide, please. So water ethics has generated a kind of a small literature, not just from me, but by a lot of people. Starting in 1993, Sandra Pastel wrote a chapter on water ethics in her book, Last Oasis. From 97 to 2004, UNESCO produced 11 reports on water and ethics in different sectors, including groundwater. In 2007, Botín Foundation published an edited volume on water ethics that has a lot of good material and is available as PDF on the, you'll find it on the internet. Water ethics foundational readings by Brown and Schmidt in 2010. Next slide. And 2012, a special issue of Water Policy on water ethics. My own book came out in 2013. 2014, Just Water, which talks about the Catholic views of water. And 2017, Global Water Ethics by Raphael Ziegler and myself. Next slide. And Just Water, second edition, came out in 2018. Loving Water Across Religions, looking at different religions and water in 2018. In 2019, my second edition came out, and a new book by Neil Cadorn called Water Ethics and Introduction. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but it's all big picture stuff. And the challenge is to relate it to actual cases. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to, next slide, please. So where I see a kind of exciting congruence and symbiosis is the marriage of water ethics with water values, because there's a lot of interest in water values. I can't say there's a lot of interest in water ethics. I'm trying to make it more interesting, but everybody seems to agree that values are important for water and we need to expand our concept of values. And the Dutch government has been supporting for the last 2 years the Valuing Water initiative. And these quotes are taken from the preamble to their initiative. Values determine preferences about how water can and may be used. Valuing water offers a structured and transparent mechanism and supports an inclusive stakeholder water resources management process. These are the interpreters for that mouthful. Next slide. Yeah. So how to operationalize water values and how to bridge the interest in water values with ethics that can guide us into what we should do about it. We have values about maintaining biodiversity in the aquatic biodiversity. What do we do to realize those values? Well, you maintain environmental flow in the river. That's one of the clear kind of marching orders. But the first step, as I said earlier, is to identify and map water values, and then reach a working consensus, document the values into a statement, which I like to call charter. Next, click. Apply the principles to water decisions, click. Monitor compliance, click, sorry. And then resolve conflicts, click. And go and just keep the cycle going. When you have conflicts, you have to go back and check in with the consensus building again. I like to use 5 categories of water values. There's nothing necessarily fundamental about 5 categories, but it works for me. So the first 3 are the triple bottom line of environmental, economic, social as categories of water values. And next slide, next click. And next click. And then the 2 that I add, I'll go back one. yeah, the two that I add, the two categories that I think are important to add when we're talking about water values are cultural values and governance values. Cultural values, because are to me, the essential thing about water ethics is having a relationship to water. And we can have a relationship to rivers. So the indigenous people all have, talk to their rivers or sing to their rivers. We don't do that, but we walk along the rivers. We get the lottery and invest a lot of money into floating down the Grand Canyon to enjoy the Colorado River that way. So I think that one of the big areas of potential for realizing water ethics is through cultural values. And the other one is governance values. We've been talking about within the water world, it's kind of old, it's not any longer new to talk about participation, but there are always new ways of realizing stakeholder participation and engagement in water decision making. Next slide. So I want to use the Santa Cruz Transboundary Aquifer in Arizona and Sonora as just a way of focusing our discussion a little bit about what would it look like to apply ethics to a real case, to a real transboundary aquifer. And the Santa Cruz River, as you probably know, starts in south central Arizona and goes south into Sonora and then curves around and goes north. Next slide. And it goes north and it joins the Gila River near Phoenix in Arizona. It's a 210-mile river that 270 of those miles, roughly, are 170 of those miles are in the US and 40 miles in Mexico. Next slide. Sometimes wet, usually dry. That's Tucson. The next slide. And when I say template for mapping water values, I really just mean a matrix and put the categories of values on the top and the types of water use on one side, and then think about or analyze or interview people about how a particular water use type ripples across those different domains of values. So for example, water released to keep the ecosystem healthy is obviously serving an environmental purpose, but it's also serving a social value, some cultural values, and economic values, and it also needs to be governed. So it impacts all the categories of values. Next slide. So I want to go through and just talk about the 5 categories of values. There'll be 5 slides coming, and they're all kind of similar. Environmental values so these are hypothetical water values of the basin stakeholders. I didn't ask them. I'm just kind of guessing. I used to live in Tucson, so I feel I have some relationship there. But probably our stakeholders are interested in a healthy river and wetlands, clean water, adequate flow, fish and biodiversity, a stable river channel, healthy aquifer, and clean water in the aquifer. Next slide. We're moving to economic values. We want water for irrigation. We want water-saving crops that aren't going to waste the water. We want good jobs from those farming practices. And so for me, the good jobs from certain farming practices supported by water from the basin, that's a water ethical issue. You can say, well, that's not water, that's jobs. But to me, those jobs wouldn't be there without the water. The water might not be there if we don't take care of the water ethically. That's an area that I'd welcome questioning on, is how far out from the water itself do we need to feel responsible as water managers or water governors? Next slide, please. There are a lot of social values that stakeholders are concerned about or interested in. They want safe drinking water. They want affordable and accessible water. They want water that they can swim in and recreate in. And they want adequate water for farming. So this is an economic value, but it's also social, because we want to keep the next generation on the farm. They're not going to stay on the farm if they don't have water. We don't want pollution from local industries, but we do want local industries for jobs. So next slide. Cultural values are often about what not to do to your water, to your river. Just let's keep the river, let's keep it flowing, let's keep it intact and healthy, and that will be enough. But sometimes we have to get involved in active management to make that happen. Next slide. And then the governance values, to me, the most important governance values that I've worked on in my own career is participation. I worked on water user associations in Asia as part a lot of my career. But the idea that the users of the water really need to be involved in the decision making about how that water is, how the water is maintained and sustained. And that's where I see river basin organizations and aquifer organizations as being an interesting type of institution to talk about, maybe in the questions. Next slide. So this is a summary slide of just what I mean by kind of a matrix of value categories on the top and types of water use on the vertical axis, and just seeing how there's, you read through this, which I'm not going to do because I don't have time, but they all relate to each other, and there's no such thing as the urban water. I mean, it's urban water, but it has ripple effects or multiplier effects on other categories. Next slide. So to me, ethics can guide water management towards an expanded set of benefits. And a small example from the Santa Cruz Basin, Sanavir district of the Tohono O'odham Nation, is using Central Arizona Project water for recharging their part of the Santa Cruz Basin, which was depleted over the last 50 years through the Mission copper mine south of Tucson. So they're kind of replacing their lost water, lost to the copper mine, with imported water from the Colorado River via Phoenix and Tucson to the Sanavir district, and they're letting the tail end of the water transfer trickle into their aquifer. Next slide. So it seems that transboundary aquifer management has necessarily focused on resource protection as the most, you have to protect it before you can manage it. Characterizing and monitoring aquifer dynamics, protecting against contamination, negotiating shared water allocations, building legal and institutional capacities. That seems to me what transboundary aquifer management has been developing. And what I'm suggesting, next slide, is that we can create more value from water that can be relevant to the transboundary aquifer context. Even things as kind of wimpy sounding as placemaking through water heritage. This is a rock art in Kings Canyon, Saguaro National Park West in Arizona. But that rock art is by a seep so it's a water-related rock art. Supporting healthy food systems with sustainable agriculture, that's a way of getting more value out of water. Implementing the human right to water for social justice, as we heard this morning, that's a way of using water, I guess it's a favoring access to water by the disenfranchised marginal communities first is a way of maximizing the impact on human justice, social justice. Restoring rivers and wetlands, of course, respecting indigenous water sovereignty, which is a huge issue in both Mexico and the US, and encouraging industries to practice water stewardship, which can also be a win-win for them because it's hard for them to come up with water stewardship best practices on their own. With a little help, they can maybe see some business advantage in having a water stewardship program. Next slide. So this is a rhetorical question. Can an ethics approach work in a transboundary context? I hope so. But transboundary stakeholders, just like non-transboundary stakeholders, have an interest in protecting their aquifer and in supporting other ethical value principles. So that, in a way, I don't think it matters that we're dealing with the transboundary. It makes it a little more challenging, but it also makes it more interesting. So they may kind of cancel each other out, and maybe it's not as hard as we think. There will always be diversity of values among stakeholders. You have more than 2 or 3 stakeholders, you're going to have a diversity of values. But they can give emphasis, you can give emphasis to what holds people together rather than what splits them apart. So there's ample congruence of interest for constructive dialogue and problem solving, I think. Next slide. Another advantage of water ethics, another benefit from using a water ethics perspective is that it can help inspire new design parameters and spark innovation. Green infrastructure for flood management. The reason for adopting a green infrastructure approach, it's more complicated or it's new, it's not as easy to find experts in it, but if you have a strong environmental ethic in your brain about how should we manage our aquifer over the long term. Well, we want to do something that's good for the environment, so we'll spend a little more time looking for just the right design for our green infrastructure. More effective mine water management, multifunctional agricultural practices, which produce carbon sequestration as well as food and cash. Revaluing old technologies like fish ladders to protect biodiversity, the reuse of wastewater. All these kind of good things to do can be motivated and incentivized not only with subsidies, but with ethics. I mean, you think of ethic as sort of kind of a moral subsidy where you get to do a good thing today and look for a broader range of benefits to justify or to do things in a different way in order to protect a particular set of kind of lead values that will also drive other values at the same time. Next slide. So the takeaways that I would suggest you try to take away through the happy hour, that groundwater is unseen, but like surface water, it's precious. We have a responsibility to use it or not use it wisely. Ethics provides an set of analytical tools to do this. The susceptibility of groundwater to contamination and the difficulty of monitoring aquifer quality or abstractions render a shared sense of water ethics all the more important as a substitute for hard to enforce regulations. Next. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, very much. I was about to tell you you had just 1 minute left.
Okay, so we do have here at least 6 questions. Let me see, I'm just gonna post it again on the chat. David, so
yes.
If you can, I put it in there. It should be just coming right from Rob, Joseph, Luzma.
You can start saying them, Sam, even though we have limited time. I mean, Dr. David would like
Oh, I
to
see.
hear them.
I see the questions where they start. From Joseph.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one that you think might be good for you, that you want to elaborate.
What is the relation of knowledge on the topic of water ethics and water value? For example, especially knowledge on groundwater flow systems. I don't understand the question.
Okay. There was one question there from Joel. It says, any comments on the groundwater and geoethics of the Oporto Congress? Or, I don't know, this might be ethics for groundwater. That's
Okay.
related to
Well,
your comment.
I know the geologists have started a very active group on geoethics. And I've just contributed a paper on how the ethics of managing the hydrosphere. I tried to take a geological title, but I think we're pretty much on the same page with geoethics. But I guess I just read the latest book that came out on water ethics by this Dutch professor, Nielke Doorn, and she's a philosopher as well as an engineer. And her big point, which I find very empowering, is that she's not going to tell us what we should do or what the ethics are. To her, it's more about process of first clarifying your own values and then thinking through how a proposed intervention, a dam, for example, is going to impact on those values. And almost always, the value impacts are, there are some good ones and some bad ones, and you just have to think it through. So on one hand, I was frustrated reading her book that she's not giving us any answers, and on the other hand, I thought, well, you don't want me telling you what you should do, but what I think can do that's useful, or at least she does to me, is explains how to think about it and how to go about analyzing it and doing your own, it's like you're doing your own laboratory experiment.
I do have here a question that I think is about two questions that are very interesting. And I think this one is more for a Westerner perspective, which is how much does water pricing steer a community to value water? When it is cheap, it's easy to waste.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's true. I think water pricing can be a very important part of conservation, but you have to have social safety nets if you have water pricing. And the other thing I don't like about water pricing is you're telling the citizenry that water has a price, and I think we should be telling them that water is priceless. And
that is correct.
And you can't trade it in for money. So, but for an urban water system, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we have some of the most expensive water in the country. Not the most, but it's up there. And I think that's right, because it's very scarce, but we need more controls than just pricing controls, because people still waste water. If they have money, they don't care. So
before we're running out of time, David, so for the community, something that I see in terms of water ethics and professional ethics, this is a group of people, a congress or a conference for two different nations that we are dealing with very delicate issues, so water among countries. What would you recommend in terms of water ethics, or some thought or advice in terms of, hey guys, you're dealing with something that is super valuable for both countries?
Well,
any thought?
Yeah, I do have a thought about that, which is, and maybe we could even come back to it in other presentations or other discussions. I haven't heard anything about going local. To me, the Santa Cruz River, there should be, I would like to see a Santa Cruz River Stakeholder Association, binational, local. Maybe keep the federal government out of it, or just, and I know it's really hard now with building the wall and making it, the boundary is becoming harder rather than softer. But Zoom gets through borders pretty well. Maybe it could be a Zoom organization, a virtual organization. but I really think that there's an opportunity for, particularly on aquifer management, transboundary, of decentralizing. Take the Dublin water principles to heart of subsidiarity, that try to manage at the lowest possible level. Don't go floating up to the national level all the time. So that's where I would see putting the local stakeholders and the local leaders in the driver's seat and saying, here, let's maybe give them some seed funding to start an organization, which wouldn't cost very much if it's virtual. And even though I know there's internet problems, but a lot of people have Zoom. So anyway, that's one thing I would suggest, is that go more local, let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of thing.
I think just one last comment, and I think this was from Sharon, in terms of that. She noted that all the time the transboundary applies to borders with tribal nations, and that's something that she was mentioning. And she was referring to, what is your answer to question 3 in the contact or in the context of tribal nations?
Okay. Well, the time of the transboundary. Yeah, I mean, I agree that transboundary is. I don't know of transboundary aquifers in my kind of Rolodex file, but I think that that indigenous territories, the borders of indigenous territories are real borders, and they are similar to an international boundary.
I think we're good in there. I don't know, just don't want to go that far on the agenda. Any other comment, question?
No, I think we should keep. I mean, we can talk about this. I mean, I was really looking. Personally, I was really looking to hear your presentation, David, because this is something that really matters. At the end of the day, is basically just people talking to each other, you know, and we think different sometimes. We value things different. At that local, personal, even personal level, not even local, we start with persons, especially when we're talking about groundwater, becomes very personal, private property. So it becomes a little more attached to people than surface water, at least from my perspective. So
I think the challenge is, the kind of exciting challenge is to find ways. We have these, you and I have really different views about what the water should be used for. Well, let's find a way that we can both be happy, that we can, you know, you use it first and then I'll use it. I mean, you can do it sequentially, or you can recycle the water, or you somehow. But that's, to me, there's a tiny, within the business literature, there's a journal of business ethics. And it was started, part of the motivation for starting the Journal of Business Ethics was the role of ethics in driving innovation. Because if you can clarify your values and you're clear about what's really important to you, you'll be motivated to protect your values, and somebody else will be motivated to protect their values. And that's how innovations come about.
and that's how this forum was created, actually. It is based on values. The Permanent Forum on National Waters has its own ethics code and its own values. And we are very, I mean, every time that we have like a discussion, not a discussion, well, a conversation about what we should do about something, we go back to that. And then we say, no, I mean, this is how we should behave, or this is how we move forward. And as long as we all agree on those values, then we can move forward on the same channel and with the same agreement. So that's where innovation comes in. That's where passion comes in as well. So anyway, we can keep going and we can talk about this on the happy hour.
Yeah. Let's give him an electronic round of applause. Yay!
Thank you.
Thank you, David. We're going to move to our discussion panel number 2. This is the topic, groundwater and surface water interactions. Very interesting, one of my favorites too. Everything is my favorite here. The case of the Colorado River Basin and the Rio Bravo Basin. I'm going to start introducing our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Jose Luis Castro Ruiz, which I like to call him my colleague. Holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Southern California. He is a professor researcher at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Monterrey, Mexico, in the Department of Urban and Environmental Studies. His research interests include border and human development, transboundary water management, institutions, governance, and local capacities. Thank you, Jose Luis, for agreeing to do this, and please take the lead. You're going to introduce your speakers of your panel, and then we're going to move forward with questions 1 to 4.
Thank you. Let me welcome you all to this discussion panel number 2, which, like Rosario was saying, is about one of the subjects of utmost importance along the common region between Mexico and the U.S. It is the groundwater and surface water interactions, the case of the Colorado River Basin versus the Rio Grande Bravo Basin. At this time, we're going to have 4 panelists who are specialists on the subject, and I'd like to introduce them. Let me just first say that we're going to proceed on the same way as panel number 1. We're going to have presentations of 3 minutes for each panelist, covering each of the questions. And then after that, we're going to have questions and answers section of 20 minutes about. Luckily, after this, we're going to have the Calavera session. So I think we're going to be sort of relaxed. It's going to be a more relaxed panel than the first one. So let me introduce the panelists. First of all, we have Dr. Leopoldo Isaac Alanis from National University of Mexico. He holds a degree in civil engineering from the Faculty of Engineering at the UNAM. He also obtained a specialization diploma in hydraulic. After that, he completed his master's thesis under the mentorship of Dr. Gonzalez Villarreal on the identification of the effects of climate change in the Colorado River Basin. He has participated in projects related to dam safety and climate variability analysis in the Colorado River Basin. Also, we have Dr. Jude Benavides, an old friend of mine. Dr. Jude Benavides is an associate professor of hydrology and environmental sciences at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He specializes in hydrographic and water quality studies in and around the delta of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, with a recent emphasis on watershed planning and watershed characterization studies. He has served on the editorial board of the American Society of Civil Engineering's Journal of Hydrologic Engineering, and currently serves on the editorial board of the Texas Water Journal. Next, we have Dr. Samuel Sandoval, also an old friend. He is an associate professor in water resources management at University of California, Davis. He is responsible for the water management and policy research program. Samuel has explored strategies to improve the water management for human and environmental requirements. Dr. Sandoval has focused his research in the transboundary basins on the Rio Grande Bravo, Colorado River, and the state of California. And finally, let me present Dr. Anita Millman from the University of Massachusetts. She is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation in the School of Earth and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Millman's research examines on the multi-level governance of water resources with a focus on responses to hydroclimatic and other sources of environmental change. She earned a PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master of Engineering from the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University. Those are our 4 panelists. All of them are specialists on the subject, and we're going to pose them the first question in this session. The first question goes, What are, excuse me. The first question goes, what are the most salient characteristics of these processes, physical, political, institutional, environmental, etc., in each international basin? That's the first question, and let me give the floor to Dr. Leopoldo Isaac Alanis from UNAM. Go ahead, doctor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. On behalf of Fernando Gonzalez, I appreciate the invitation. Dr. Gonzalez had a last-minute event that he couldn't avoid, so he asked me to be with you today. Thank you very much. I would like to talk about 4 topics: social and legal, water quality, groundwater, and climate change. The population, the border between the United States and Mexico has grown rapidly from half a million in the 40s to more than 12 million people in the last decade. About the water quality, the Colorado River Basin presents the solid concentration in the deliveries on the side of the Tijuana and Bravo River. The problem is sanitation. For the reason several minutes have been signed for the construction of infrastructure such as treatment plants that were designed to solve these problems. One of them is the international plant in California. About the groundwater, the groundwater is an issue very complex because there must be a balance between the extraction and the recharge. So, for example, we have lost approximately 80 million cubic meters for the recharge due to the lining of the All-American Canal. This victory affects the aquifer because the withdrawals are the same. Also, the other topic is the migration of water for the other basins. It's another issue because that we have to take into account because it reduces the return flows and consequently infiltrations to aquifer levels. The cities LA and San Diego have a supply of 1,480 million cubic meters about the Colorado River Basin. Next, please. I'll talk about the climate change in Colorado River Basin. At the Institute Engineer, climate change variability analysis have been carried out in the Colorado River Basin with 88-year sample to detect change in the variables of precipitation and temperature. No evidence of statistically significant changes was found in precipitation. However, evidence was found of a cyclical series with an approximate period of 13 years was found, reflecting its effects in the runoff around the basin. On the other hand, we found temperatures significant increases of approximately 2 degrees Celsius in upper basin and between 1 to 2 degrees Celsius in the lower basin. Thank you very much. That's all.
Luis?
Yes.
I think he's on mute.
Jose Luis?
Yes, Rosario?
You're mute.
Ah, okay.
Now is the turn for Jude
Jude.
Benavides.
Okay, please go ahead, Jude.
Can you hear me okay, Rosario?
Yes, we can hear you, Jude.
Excellent. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak to everyone. I've enjoyed the day. I've had my grad students in and out of this in between their classes, and they've also had some great feedback and positive comments as well. So a whole bunch of great presenters earlier in the morning and throughout the whole day. Some of this information on my first slide has already been covered. Really, the answer for me is the geography and hydrology, or I call it the hydrography, as most people work, of each basin. They're comparable and establish their water stress nature. And to me, in my somewhat biased opinion, this drives the entire problem when you add the fact that the geography includes a binational basins on both sides. They're comparable basins, roughly similar in size. Both are what we would call pulse flow dominant, with a very low base flow for long periods of time and then suddenly high flows. They are both arid to semi-arid landscape. There's some subtropical down on the bottom of the Rio Grande. Both are reliant on upstream stored water, snowpack, mountain precipitation, or orographic precipitation. And the pre and post dam discharges, after we have basically controlled these rivers for agriculture and municipal water use, are drastically different. They're already low to begin with, but are now very, very low. Next slide, please. How this geography differs between the two basins is important to point out. And I think other presenters have already talked about this. The Colorado has more of an upstream versus downstream concern, more longitudinal concerns, but not only limited to that, as we've already talked about, particularly when it comes to the groundwater component. The Rio Grande has both upstream and downstream, as well as lateral, left bank, right bank concerns. And while I'm coming at it as a surface water hydrologist, all of these problems relate to the groundwater world as well. There are reduced in-stream flows and freshwater inflows to the lower portions of these rivers that some of my colleagues and some of my co-presenters here have already mentioned earlier today. And that's, I think, is particularly important when these factors are already poorly understood, poorly emphasized. There's a huge uncertainty in these, and the impact this has on groundwater availability, particularly in the downstream portions of these rivers, is largely poorly understood, even more so than the rest of the basin, and vice versa, the impact of groundwater on surface water. So we have here a huge potential for adaptive management strategies and data collection and analysis strategies to address this data gap and resulting sustainability concerns. Next slide, please. One of the issues we have to discuss, and I think others have already talked about it a little bit, is what happens when these flows are so drastically altered and reduced to the point to where base flows are practically zero. In fact,
yes. Could you please finish? We are about to 3 minutes.
Already?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'm sorry. Both of these rivers have deltas that are highly impacted by reduced environmental in-stream flows, and this reduction in pulse flows, even flood pulses that have shaped the delta, are now heavily curtailed. So this has resulted in massive hydrographic and ecological changes to the region, and has resulted, next slide, please, in drastic changes to the delta. And both deltas have received significantly impacted freshwater inflows, and as a result, the attempts to manage this has resulted in reduced pulse flows. Last slide. This is the last one real quick. Next slide, please. Or is that my last one? Yeah, that's my last one. The final comment on this is I believe that the hydrography of this has driven the problem, and that we have a huge issue in relation to the need of the deltas. And I think we've underserved the deltas and the estuaries in this region. And I was very happy to hear that environmental concern be echoed and raised earlier today. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to have Samuel, please. I don't know if I mentioned it, but we have 3 minutes for each panelist, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm going to jump right in. So what you're seeing here is actually the let's go back to what Jude was mentioning, what is the natural regime and then how it is right now. So that will be the regime of the Rio Grande. It used to have 10 cubic kilometers. What you're seeing there in San Marcial, that's the snowmelt regime, that it has this kind of a snowmelt pulse. That will be in Presidio. That's the natural flow. Keep it going, Gabi. That will be the Rio Conchos. In that part of the river, the river duplicates. It was 2.5 cubic kilometers on the upper portion, 2 from the Conchos. So in that part, the river duplicates. Keep it going. That will be the Rio Conchos. Something interesting here is that we had a bimodal river, a river that in terms of surface water, groundwater interactions, you see in the dry season, it was all the groundwater base flow that was feeding into the river. And in the bimodal portion of it, it was also at the tails. Keep it going, Gabi. All the way to the mouth. So you can see how, keep it going. Next. That's how the mouth of the river. That's how the river used to look like. This will be how that specific flow, those natural flows, helped the ecology there. You can see that there were some spawning on that right portion of the hydrograph, that it came from some of the snow melt in the green hydrograph, or that they were also related to the blue hydrograph, which is the monsoon season. You can also see that a lot of species were related to this. And the next one, this is what Jude was mentioning. So the red line is how much water is left in the river. You can see that there are places that we have no water at all. Could you go a little bit ahead, Gabi? That is Lobatos, the natural flow regime, and in the red one is the current regime. This is San Marcial. Next one. This is Presidio. This data is coming from a very good paper from Schmidt et al. From Utah. The next one. Then that's when two institutions work together super well. That will be the Rio Conchos that we estimated at Davis. That's the red is how it works, how it is right now. Below Conchos, keep it going. You can see that by now the bimodal signal is gone. Keep it going. Keep it going. Yep. This is what Jude was mentioning. There is no water there. So yeah, I think in this case, what you're seeing is that we had this on this dry season, the surface water, groundwater interactions, how the ecosystem evolved, and what we have left to the river, which in some parts is nothing. Thanks.
Thank you, Samuel. We move on now to Anita, please. Anita Milman, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Well, my comments will concur with, but also quite differ from my prior colleagues, in that I'm going to focus on the role of institutions. As I see, there are 3 characteristics influencing the current state of how surface water and groundwater interactions are addressed in both basins, and that these 3 characteristics apply equally across both basins. So the first of those characteristics is the structure of authority over ground and surface waters. As all in attendance are aware, that from the binational perspective, the existing treaties between the countries do not directly address surface water and groundwater interactions. And then when we look within the 2 countries, surface water and groundwater interactions are governed differently. Within Mexico, the federal government oversees groundwater throughout the country, whereas in the United States, groundwater is primarily managed by the states, and each state has its own system for addressing surface water and groundwater interactions. The federal government of the U.S. primarily only steps in and has authority in relation to interstate compacts and issues that can be connected to interstate commerce, such as navigable waters and endangered species. So there's no consolidated center for decision making. Next slide, please. The second key characteristic I see as addressing surface water groundwater interactions in both basins is the legal distinction between surface and groundwater regimes, primarily within certain states in the United States. A number of U.S. states do not account for connectivity between surface and groundwater in their water rights regimes. So New Mexico, Colorado water rights systems do address surface water and groundwater interactions, yet Texas, Arizona, and California treat them as legally distinct. So while within those states, surface water groundwater interactions may be addressed through environmental protection laws or water resources planning efforts, generally, when surface water groundwater interactions are addressed in those states, it's reactively as the result of conflict rather than the state's broader water management regime. Next slide, please. So the third characteristic I see as influencing the treatment of surface water and groundwater interactions in the two basins has to do with the complexity of flows and the need for substantial data and analysis to determine the relationship between groundwater use and surface water flows. Generally speaking, when we're looking to bring about some form of policy change in an institutional management system, often a starting point for negotiations is knowledge and data. We need some form of evidence of what kind of actions are leading to what sort of results and how changes could resolve that problem. But knowledge of the system, though critical, is lacking, particularly as it relates to groundwater flows across both basins. And so the result of these three characteristics is first that it's extremely challenging to find paths within the existing institutional regimes to address surface water and groundwater interactions broadly. And secondly, that the institutional arrangements have created a sense of ownership and entitlement that portray the situation as a zero-sum game. Whereas there's this perspective, I'm not saying it's true, but there's a perspective that in order to solve the problem, somewhere, someone is going to have to lose their control over water, be that surface or groundwater, that they see as rightfully theirs.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Anita. And now we're going to move to question number 2. The question number 2 goes, which events were relevant to the historical evolution of these processes? Are we going to follow the same order as before?
Yes.
Dr. Leopoldo Isaac, please go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Each basin has had its important events. For example, for the Tijuana River Basin, it was the construction for the international wastewater treatment plant, which treats approximately 1,000 liters per second and flows into the Pacific Ocean. It's also important to mention the San Antonio de los Buenos plant in Tijuana for the water treatment for the city. Great events have taken place in Colorado River. One of the most important is the construction of the system dam, the dam system. The most important of each is the Glen Canyon and the Hoover Dam. A curious fact is that this entire system of dams was built in 1983 to the atypical rains. As well as the construction of the Los Angeles aqueduct that supplies the city with 1,480 million cubic meters per year, and the All-American Canal that leads the flow to the irrigation district and many places. Finally, we have the international dams and the Rio Bravo, the La Amistad Dam, and the Falcon Dam. It's worth to mention that a real event was the signing of Minute 289, where they refer to the sanitation and monitoring projects for water quality with the construction of treatment plants and the other works that allow the sanitation of the cities involved. Next, please. About the legal framework, there are many treaties, meetings and acts that represent the history of Transboundary Basin. But the most significant are the Peace, Friendship Limits and the Settlement Treaty, which establishes the international border, the International Water Distribution Treaty signed in 1944 after 96 years of negotiation, where delivery bonds are established for each country. As a result of NAFTA agreements established in 1994, many projects for development of water infrastructure were financed. And finally, to make that dedicates the chapter 24 to the environment where water.
Time's up, excuse me.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, we will move on. Dr. Benavides, please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I think the issue here is already been discussed again, plugging up the rivers. And as Leopoldo just said, dams and reservoirs located throughout both river networks. Also withdrawals and diversions. A large number of withdrawals and diversions have happened, and it's become commonplace for people to be able to pull water because they have a water right. And they believe that water right translates to an environmental right and to a whatever type of given right. And they forget that that has impacts. And thirdly, I meant to add this, and my previous colleagues mentioned this, is that climate change, the increased role of evaporation, the great talk by Christopher Milley, our headliner today, talking about the role the evaporation plays in reducing the availability of water at the surface, and then of course related water in the groundwater as well. This has all resulted in greatly altered natural hydrology, which has almost become the new normal in the region. Reduced pulse flows, both in volume and frequency, and reduced base flows. So while there is some adequate research on the impact of this flow alteration in the surface water world, I really believe that impacts to groundwater and surface water, groundwater interaction are far less understood. The pictures on the right you see here, that struck me as very similar. These are not my pictures. Francisco Zamora from the Sonoran Institute for the Colorado River, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for the Rio Grande River on the bottom. They appear to be very similar. They have dry regions around them, and they struggle at times to reach their resulting base elevation. Next slide, and the last slide. I wanted to put this in. I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir mostly here, but previous colleagues mentioned research that has to do with GRACE, Graduate Recovery and Climate Experiment, really referred to as the scale in the sky. What I thought was really important here was that GRACE has revealed significant changes in terrestrial water storage across the globe. And highlighting, and you can see there's two red spots there. I know they're probably pretty small for you to see, but both over Texas and northeastern Mexico and the Colorado River Basin as well. We have quantified this data at regional scales because this type of approach has unimpeded, it's unimpeded by sparse measurements or restricted data access policies. That happens when we're struggling across a border to do that. And that reason might be for multiple different reasons, and it's not my area to get into. But I believe as a take-home point here, that the need to couple small-scale, large area studies with large-scale, small area studies guided by and sustained by local experts, not only academics, is key to solving this issue, or at least moving towards some sort of sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jude. Sam, please go ahead.
Yes. So, in my case, I mean, there are many things to get to the 1906 treaty, but some of the key historical aspects to get there, it was before we have a lot of tribes living in there. Then in the colonial, all the circles that you're seeing there, all those are the specific locations that we have European colonial settlements. Then Mexico's independence. Later it will come the Texas independence in 1938. 10 years later, it will come the Mexican War or U.S. invasion, depending on which side of the border you are. And that one, it was defined the navigability of the river. Later, Love, general, he actually navigated the river. And later in 1877, the Desert Land Act increased a lot of water use in New Mexico and Colorado. And basically, what that did is that put no water in El Paso in 1880. So that's when actually it came a lot of the problems in there that put these kind of two doctrines. One, that it was more about sharing waters between countries, and that because the U.S. the river was not navigable, demanded some damages and compensations. And then on the other one, the Harmon Doctrine, which is basically I do what I can for what I want to do in my country. So that will be one piece. The next one, Gabby. will be how to get to the Treaty of 1944. And basically in that one, so the Treaty of 1906, the Convention of 1906 only allocates water between Elephant Butte and El Paso. Then we have in 1908 the Magic Valley, the lower Rio Grande, a big increase in the agriculture, the Mexican Revolution, or the Civil War, the World War I, the Colorado River Compact on 1922, the Rio Grande Compact on 1929. And then we have a big drought, the oil nationalization, and with the oil nationalization from U.S. companies, it came a lot of tensions. The All-American Canal, so the U.S. in the Colorado didn't rely on diverting water from Mexican territory to the Imperial. And then the World War II, and of course the Treaty of 1944. And in this one, basically what happened in there is that it was a good division of water between Mexico and the U.S. And in terms that whatever the U.S. will say in the Colorado could have been, or it was used against the U.S. in the Rio Grande and vice versa. Whatever it was done or it was said in the Rio Grande, it could have been used as part of it. So the last slide will be what happened also with the native Mexicans or the Native Americans. The basin got chickenpox and we kill it. It has a lot of reservoirs in there.
Thank you, Sam. Time's up.
Thanks.
Go ahead. We move on to Anita. Please go ahead.
Great, terrific. Well, I will continue with my trend of a lens on the institutions. And I would say that I think much of the current situation in terms of how surface and groundwater interaction are addressed in the basin stems understandably from the history of groundwater development. Clearly, groundwater was not a salient concern between the U.S. and Mexico when the treaties were negotiated in 1906 and in 1944, or even the interstate compacts in 1938. But since then, as our colleagues have described, there's been growth, immense growth in demands for water, as well as ongoing drought and climate change in the region. And I'll add to that also shifting decades of shifting paradigms about how we view water should be managed jointly for both human and ecosystem needs. And I will argue that these pressures have led to a number of ongoing policy actions that aren't specifically aimed at surface water and groundwater interactions, but they set the stage for addressing them. So next slide, please. So at the binational level, I think some of these policy actions that we've seen have been minutes to the treaty. They are hinting at the need to address groundwater pumping and in-stream flows. These include, as discussed earlier today, minutes 242, which limited pumping, and then minutes 316, 319, and 323, which are looking at transboundary flows for environmental purposes. I'll also say that within each country, we're seeing advancements in laws that are aiming to address environmental flows, and though those are not necessarily explicitly addressing surface water, groundwater interactions, they implicitly require consideration of them. So Mexico published in 2012 and ratified in 2017 an environmental flow standard. Texas legislation passed in 2007 and followed by 2014 rulemaking about environmental flows in the Rio Grande. And there have also been developments in New Mexico and Arizona in relation to appropriation of water for in-stream flows. Further, within the United States, there's been a listing of species under the Endangered Species Act that's leading to action. So the Texas hornshell, the silvery minnow, the razorback chub, and more, the federal government has the obligation to protect those species. And in many instances, the only way to do so is to address the impacts of groundwater pumping on surface water flows. Next slide, please. And lastly, as I wrap up, I'll just mention a few other recent events that I think are going to influence the future of how surface water and groundwater interactions occur. We've already talked about earlier today the Colorado Drought Contingency Plan. Within the United States, this is really driving states to turn to conjunctive management of surface water and groundwater in order to respond to drought. We currently, this year, have 2 Supreme Court cases about interstate groundwater that are also going to set a precedent for interstate management in the USA. One of them of particular interest is Texas versus New Mexico and Colorado, which is a dispute about how New Mexico groundwater pumping is influencing underflow into Texas and therefore influences agreement with the Rio Grande Compact. And lastly, I'll wrap up with California appellate court case from 2018 that held that the public trust doctrine applies to groundwater pumping in California, particularly when it impacts navigable waterways. Now,
Anita,
while this is not in the basin, I'll just say that Texas and New Mexico also have the public trust doctrine, so it may have an impact on their futures.
Okay, thank you very much, Anita. We move to the next question, question number 3. The question number 3 goes, what has been the U.S. and Mexican government's role concerning these processes, policy prescriptions, agreements, projects, etc.? Please go ahead, Dr. Leopoldo Isaac.
Thank you very much. Well, the relationship between Mexico and the United States has been really good. The problems that have arisen have been settled through agreements and minutes. That's okay, the relationship, the communication between our countries. The government of the US and Mexico have created institutions to solve the problems that arise in transboundary basins, such as International Boundary and Water Commission and the USDR, respectively. They have also received support from the North American Development Bank and the Commission for Border Environmental Cooperation. All of this is in the framework of good water governance and sustainability for the basin. That's all I can do for this question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, then we move to Dr. Jude Benavides. Please, Jude, go ahead.
Thank you, Jose Luis. I think the main issue here, I'm not a policy expert, and there's other people that are probably more set up for this type of question. But what I can mention are a few points, I believe, centered around this quote on the bottom right, which is not mine. It's from Osvaldo Hinojosa Huerta, the director of the Water Wetlands Program. Pro Natura Noroeste, Noroeste, sorry. The rivers affect the health of our seas, wildlife, communities, and economies. Restoring freshwater habitats is no longer optional, it's imperative. This stems from, I think, some of the flaws in our policies, and again, stemming on, and not to beat a dead horse here, the lack of real emphasis on in-stream environmental and freshwater inflows to estuaries, delta regions, and downstream regional water rights has had detrimental impacts on the regions, culturally, economically, and of course, hydrologically. And this comes from the fact that, and this is not my research, but many researchers have started to say that there's been a large-scale, greater emphasis on water availability in some upstream reservoirs as it functions and relates to flood control, and that drought planning, while long-term, is often secondary to flood control concerns. This means that despite decades of growing emphasis on drought impacts in the national water planning and management area, significant problems remain. The emphasis, again, tends to remain on post-drought economic loss compensation when drought does happen, and that there's less emphasis on reduction of impact and damage susceptibility of droughts. And this is not my work. This is from a great paper, 2016 paper in water policy by Aguilar Barras et al. Out of Tecnológico de Monterrey that really brings this point forward. Moreover, downstream adaptations have resulted now as a result of these reduced inflows. The terrain or the ecology itself is changing. The infrastructure has adapted around that and needs to adapt further. And largely this becomes an environmental justice issue, both longitudinally along the river and laterally on the away from the banks of the river, because insufficient base flow and pulse flows do not sustain ecology and livability in the long term. How this relates to groundwater surface interactions and vice versa, I'm really not skilled enough to answer that question, but I think it relates to some of those critical questions that have been narrowed down as the question that we all need to work together to solve. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Please, Samuel Sandoval, please go ahead, Samuel. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think the role of the government has been kind of, it is kind of interesting because it has created all those different agreements that are in that map. So each of those different colors, it is a different agreement and how water has been divided. And those agreements basically have, paradoxically, it has broken the basin. So that's why we have sometimes no flow at certain points. The Pecos, the Forgotten Bridge in there. But at the same time, these agreements are the ones that are keeping the system together, that are kind of putting and sticking, I don't know, with duct tape together the system. So I think that's something that is has happened here. The other part that it is very important is it is a telescopic, it's a nested system. So you have the national, and then within a state, their own state and their own laws, and then within sometimes it's surface water, groundwater, or only surface water, or only groundwater. And then when you get further into a different level, a more local level, different stakeholders, agriculture, people that have actually access to dams or not dams, that they can do wells, that they have wells and surface water. That's kind of along those levels. So in this one is kind of paradoxically, the role has been kind of fragmented, but at the same time, this fragmentation has put everything stick together. The next one, Gabby. Well, this is just to mention that we have had an increased water use in Mexico. That will be along the border. On the right will be on sea, will be that for all the within the tributaries, and the upper one will be in the US. The last portion here is that even though groundwater is a shared resource, we have different points of view. So because groundwater, I have a property, I put a well, and the water under my well or under my property is my water, but it is a shared resource. And that vision has been super different between our Texas or Mexico or New Mexico. The lack of shared water resources or the vision of shared water. That will be it.
Okay, thank you. Anita, please go ahead.
Sure, so I'll focus my answer specifically over how the U.S. government has been involved in the U.S. side of the border, and specifically, again, on the federal government, not the role of the state government. And I'll argue that the role of the federal government has primarily been a facilitatory role, where it's supported interstate negotiations and agreements in relation to water sharing, and it's also within the country as well as internationally with Mexico. The federal government has also had a strong role in the provision of technical assistance through the USGS, the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, a multitude of U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and Army Corps of Engineers studies, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service studies related to ecosystems and other scientific guidance. So this technical information is used not only by the federal government in decision making, but it also filters down to influence states as well as local levels and NGOs and other stakeholders in the region that have used that information. And the federal government has also had a strong role in providing funding, particularly in grants for infrastructure improvements that, while not directly aiming to address surface water, groundwater interactions, through conservation, through other types of improvements, are actually changing the ways in which we use surface and groundwaters. Next slide, please. And lastly, and perhaps the most concrete role of the federal government in relation to surface water and groundwater interactions has been through oversight of the Endangered Species Act. Through the Upper Colorado Endangered Fish Recovery Program, the San Juan Basin River Recovery Program, the Lower Colorado Multi-Species Conservation Program, all of these efforts, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service brings together the many stakeholders that are involved and forces them to develop improved understandings of flows, including surface water and groundwater interactions, in order to develop credible plans to protect species. And many of these plans include policies and programs that are aimed at changing patterns of groundwater use to protect surface water flows, and also have some enforcement capacity to make local areas comply with differing laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are doing fine. We're saving time here. This is the next question. What actions or policies at the national or binational level could improve outcomes related to groundwater and surface water interactions in either or both basins? Please, Dr. Leopoldo Isaac, go ahead.
Thank you very much. As we have spoken, we have several opportunities to solve the transboundary basin problems. One of them is that we have to have more studies for the aquifer, and we have to share information about them for the decision making. We need a great participation from the governments of the United States and Mexico. We have to study the surface water and groundwater interaction because it's too important now this part. And we have to consider the population growth and climate change to estimate the future water demand, to have the reserves to these topics. And all these topics, the BOM2 is required to achieve the water security, the sustainability, and a good relationship between the countries involved. That's all, and I can take this.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac. Jude, please go ahead.
Sure. I think it comes down to me to two quick points here. The holistic and equitable approach is needed. I think that's been echoed by not only my co-panelists here, but previous panelists and speakers today. And the second point, which I'll get to in a second, is data collection at the local level. This first slide, I'm going to admit openly, it sounds very general, and really how do we get past that? The greater emphasis on this at the binational level and recoupling surface water and groundwater connectivity, not only across the basin, but in my opinion, particularly downstream, and leading to adaptive management of both resources. Two cases in point that I'll relate to is number one, in many cases, we find ourselves working with hydrologic data that is built off of periods of record that are not only limited in scope or time, a few decades at most, but also often those are several decades old, and are often taken during times that are not representative of the true climatological conditions of that basin. That's a hugely impactful and potentially damaging to any further research that builds off of that. I have here on the right here something that I had the good fortune of being a member of was the Basin Bay Expert Science Team. It sounds a little haughty for a team, but the BBEST team, as they call themselves, for the environmental flows recommendations. And my co-panelist Anita Millman had the picture to the upstream Rio Grande study, I believe. This was the downstream report. And when we analyzed the downstream study for this, we were told by the funding agencies to only look at the US side. How can you do an environmental flow recommendation and you're only looking at half the delta? Next slide. The data collection at the local level. What you saw, I failed to mention because I ran out of time, was the distributaries, the abandoned distributaries of the Rio Grande Delta, which is a passion of mine and a focus of some of my graduate students. Collecting data in and around these abandoned distributaries that are only abandoned because we control the flood process. We have found that there is groundwater surface water interaction between these, and some of my other colleagues at UTRGV, like Dr. Cheng, Chuling Cheng, and others, are trying to focus on this issue as well. But you can see here in this graph the drastic reduction in flows past Brownsville and the Rio Grande, and on the bottom picture, you can see the irrigation and drainage network that has replaced these distributaries, these ancient distributaries that are now abandoned hydrologically. It gets to the point to where the actual rivers that were there are seen as the polluted or dirty waterways because they have stagnant or held water, while the drainage ditches are seen as more of a clean water resource. It's ironic, but that's the case. So we need to work on these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Samuel, please go ahead.
And just to reiterate the question, in this case is what actions or policies at the national level could improve the outcomes of groundwater and surface water? And I think the changes, it can be a change in vision. If we have a vision between the two nations of semi-arid, well, a shared vision of a semi-arid basin shared from everyone and for everyone, and una cuenca semiárida de todos y para todos. That will be good. And with that, then we can start thinking about how can we improve the basin throughout, from headwaters to the mouth. The other one, if we include environmental flows, those flows will recharge the aquifers, will sustain, will bring back the surface water or groundwater interactions that I think are the bloodline of the river and what lives in the river. There are some ideas, or there are some drafts of an regulation for the 5 states in Mexico to provide water allocation similar to a water master that I think is good to put in there. The other one that is the big elephant in the room, what policies can be done, reduce the water consumption, and that is in both in the Colorado and the Rio Grande. I mean, they are over allocated. We overestimated them. We know that we don't have that much water, and we still try to keep an economic growth, even surface water or groundwater at all cost. Yeah, well, shield the basin from politics, and I think collaboration and understanding. And I put that picture because that's well, those two pictures because those are from a conference a year ago in El Paso. The two commissioners at that time, Salmon and Harkins, working together on groundwater. That really showed kind of the leadership. The other one, the picture on the top, so of many of the participants. And in that one, highly encouraged that we bring different perspective, including women. As you can see there, we have only 2 women in there, Elia and Laura, and that was it. So I think we need to bring more.
I was there, Sam, too, but I'm not in the picture.
So we had 3 in the room. Imagine that. Okay, really, the key message, a shared vision, a semi-arid basin from everyone and for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Anita, please.
Great. Well, I concur with all 3 of my colleagues. I would say that due to the complexity of the situation, I think in order to improve how surface water and groundwater interactions are addressed, what we need is a multi-pronged approach. Pragmatically, I don't think we're going to expect major action at the binational level in the near future. So in the short term, I think we primarily need to focus on localized action. And so strong emphasis needs to be on supporting and facilitating local and regional responses. And as with my colleagues, I think that includes supporting science, data, and monitoring to better understand surface water, groundwater interactions, and to provide the data and evidence needed to take action. We also need funding at the local level to help move away from a zero-sum basis by supporting mutually beneficial actions and maybe efficiency gains or alternative sources that will help to reduce conflicts in the region. And there also needs to be support for intangibles, such as dedicated agency personnel, funding for meetings, network building activities that build trust and open communication and can help with local level initiatives. As a more long-term strategy, within each country, we need to reconcile the laws to more accurately reflect the interactions between surface water and groundwater interactions. And this is going to be contentious, but it's not going to be perfect, but it is not unprecedented. Colorado made progress in the South Platte River. Idaho made strides in the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And at the binational level, while this will be challenging, I think if we look at those examples and others, we can see that what has happened is that these governmental agencies and stakeholders have created or found legal avenues that support addressing surface water groundwater interactions. And then they set up programs that would help soften the transition to the revised legal regime. Next slide, please. So in order to do this, in order to make this feasible, I think we, and by we I mean policymakers, water users, and even academics as myself, we need to be willing to engage with the issue. The topic of surface water, groundwater interactions is contentious and we've shied away from it. And we need to put it more on center stage in the policy agenda, but we need to do so in a way that is not as adversarial that solutions cannot be found. So that means we need to frame it as a problem that's resolving it will provide mutual benefits. And lastly, in order to do this, we need leadership, and this requires champions, plural. We need individuals within decision-making bodies who care about the topic and are willing to bring it forward within their organizations as well as within any forums they attend. And we also need stakeholders and affected entities to pressure policymakers and agencies for change. And these leaders need to coordinate their efforts to ensure that their actions are synergistic and generate widespread support. So in sum, I think that there are current pressures in both watersheds combined with increasing knowledge and awareness of surface water, groundwater interactions and problems are driving us to change. And the way to make that change happen is for key agencies, policymakers, and stakeholders to make the issue a priority And that means dedicating time, energy, voice, and resources to addressing the problem at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Well, thank you very much for to all of the panelists for being so acute with the time. And now we're going to move to the question and answer session. And finally, later on to the wrap up by myself, by the moderator. We're going to have 20 minutes. Let me see how we're doing with the time. I guess we're fine.
Yes, we're fine. We're fine.
We're fine, Rosario.
Yeah,
Well, we're going to have I would propose to have a relaxation of question and answers, and since we have I think this subject is very interesting, and well, all of the panelists gave a lot of insights, really. I think it's a multidisciplinary work, a very interesting work, and I will try, of course, to do my best to wrap up at the end and all of this information that I get. But now we're going to move on to the question and answer session, and let me just check how is our. We're going to move. We're going to go by trying to start with those questions directly. Address directly to any of the panelists. We're going to start with. Here's a question for Dr. Leopoldo from Marussia Renteria, and she says the increase of temperature approximately 2 degrees centigrade is for the mean value of temperatures, and what is the increment for the minimum temperature? That doesn't have to be said here. We have another question from Joel Carrillo. This is general from Sudana. Let me see. Okay, from Jorge Ramirez, Dr. Jorge Ramirez to Dr. Leopoldo again. How are you considering the All-American Canal is interacting with groundwater in that area? And do you think groundwater flows are reversing the Salton Sea to the north? Dr. Leopoldo, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. About the temperature rise, it's for the mean value, but we found the evidence was also in minimum values. That is statistically significant, but the higher temperatures tend to elevate the heat. So about the All-American Canal interacts with groundwater. Definitely the lining of the All-American Canal affects infiltration. As I said before, approximately 80 million cubic meters are lost due to this problem. I've read many cases for saline intrusion have been seen in some parts of the delta of Rio Colorado, but that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Leopoldo. We have another question from Luz Manaba. This question is for Dr. Anita Millman. Despite the differences in the structure of authority over ground and surface waters, how do you think Mexico and the U.S. could come to a common understanding and solution about the current situation in the Rio Grande Valley and the Mexican side? Thank you.
It's quite a large question you asked there. I think that one of the key challenges is not just looking at how do the US and Mexico come into a common resolution, but how do we come to a resolution even within each country as to the differences, because there are varying, as was discussed even within the water ethics panel, there are varying understandings and perspectives within each country, and those varying perspectives are putting pressures at different levels of government to do different things, which are exacerbating in some ways or I would say, exacerbating the conflict, but in some ways exactly what should happen in terms of a policy and politics process. And so that much of the dilemma is that there are differences within stakeholders within the border as well as across the border, and that makes it very difficult for, at the federal level, which is the level needed to negotiate an international agreement, it makes it very difficult for an agreement to reach. So I think there needs to be collaborative work within each country, as well as then these cross-border connections between parties that agree within each country to negotiate, which is again why I will go back to my comments about looking at the local level and raising up leadership within the each organization, each stakeholder group, and having those leaders come together to work together to discuss the situation.
Thank you, Dr. Milman. Here's another question for Dr. Jude Benavides. Do you know of any efforts for expansion of data sharing, standardization, and repositories? It seems that sources of data are highly decoupled across agencies and institutions, even at local levels.
Absolutely. That is an excellent question. And I think it becomes the question when it comes to really working together as a team. I'm aware of a few, but mostly at the U.S. federal level and state level. The HydroShare, hydroshare.org from Kwasi's group actually sets it up. You basically create data, upload it, describe it with metadata, share it with colleagues, and you even get a DOI, a digital object identifier for that bit of work, and it can be quality checked and looked at from others. The National Water Center, not the National Weather Center, the National Water Center has been working on surface flows. But I think the question's absolutely right. I'm not aware of myself. I'm not saying there aren't any out there, and hopefully other colleagues can chime in, that cover the expanse of international, upstream, downstream, lateral concerns, and depth concerns, either surface or groundwater. We have the technology to do that now, and perhaps I think one of the aims of this forum is to spur that type of work, and I would be happy to participate in it and work. Anita?
I would say one place to look would be at the U.S.-Canada border, where the IJC has worked closely with agencies on both sides of the border to develop a harmonized data set along the border. And through that, they actually had to reach an agreement on how to define the hydrostratigraphy and the watersheds, as well as what was going to be the format and the structure for collecting data into the future. So that would be the one and only source of harmonized data that I know of at the international level.
And also in the forum, we have an important database of where you can download some of the data that is related between the two nations, and also some of the tools or models. So yeah, go to the forum webpage. You're going to find a lot of resources for surface water, groundwater ecology.
Thank you. There's another question for Sam from Gaby Rendon. This is in Spanish. Si se hicieran más eficientes los sistemas de extracción que utilizan agua, por ejemplo, agricultura, es muy probable que la actividad que los usa aumente en vez de disminuir. ¿Hay alguna manera de evitar esto?
Bueno, eso lo voy a responder en español. Sí, usualmente cuando los distritos de riego, bueno, cuando existe mayor eficiencia en la irrigación, los agricultores utilizan el agua en donde saben utilizarla, que es básicamente en la agricultura. Entonces lo que hacen es que se vuelve más eficiente y se expanden. Y después lo que sucede es que el hacer, sobre todo con los sistemas presurizados, o sea, los sistemas de goteo o los sistemas de microaspersores, lo que sucede es que como están presurizados, necesitan agua todo el tiempo. Y como necesitan agua todo el tiempo, es más fácil tener la agua a disposición del agua subterránea. Entonces lo que hacen es que se conectan al agua subterránea, aunque tuvieran acceso a agua superficial, y se expanden los sistemas. Entonces es muy triste que usualmente cuando uno invierte en incrementos de eficiencia, lo que sucede es que la frontera agrícola se expande. Gracias.
Thank you, Gabby. Let me see. There's another question from Joel Carrillo, and I think this is a general question, maybe addressed to all of the panelists. It goes, how water chemistry and isotopes has been used to cross-check and define the functioning of surface water and groundwater? This is open to any of the panelists, if you may go ahead.
So one super fast is that the good enough springs that are underneath Amistad Dam, there is Ron Green. He might be somewhere here. He has done isotopes, and actually he has discovered that that stream that comes from the US side, it actually spread on a Mexican territory. So that's super cool because the water comes into one side of the river, goes underneath, and comes on the other side. There are some of those studies along the border. Jude, Anita, Leopoldo.
I have nothing else to add on that one. Thank you.
The one that may know is Rosario.
Jose Luis, do you want to wrap up?
No more replies? No more? Okay. Well, we have no more questions. Looks like this subject is kind of complex, but very interesting, and we thank to all of the audience that made all of these questions. And well, I think next what I'm going to do is to give a quick wrap up of our panel. Let me see. Okay, these 4 questions I'll try to cover, the issue, the subject from different points of view. And I think that this panel, the multidisciplinarity nature of this panel was very interesting because all of you gave, answers that complement each other. So what I'm going to do here is to touch some of the more important points on each of the questions. The first questions, many, there were, well, all of the opinions were complementary, they complement each other because, for instance, on the Rio Colorado, we know that the quality, the water quality is important. Also, the changes in annual precipitation and temperature that have been detected, and also the characteristics that are comparable between the 2 basins, like the pulse flow that is dominant, the reduced in stream flows and groundwater availability, and the need for cooperation on research, studies, and local participation. Also, what Samuel said about the changes on hydrology along the Rio Bravo, which is very interesting. If we look at the whole system, how the changes along the whole basin go, along, for instance, the Rio Conchos, when in Presidio, the union between the Rio Concho and Presidio, how this changes the hydrology of the river. Also, we have differences between the 2 countries, as Anita mentioned, and these differences are also between the system. We have a polycentric system on the US side, whereas in Mexico we have a centralized system, and these things have a high impact on the situation, on the characteristics when we compare them, when we compare the characteristics between the 2 basins. And then, of course, this makes the whole thing more complex. The need for data and analysis becomes more complex, and also it is evident that we need more data to study this. So there is a lack of data on this aspect. If we move to the question number 2, which events were relevant? Well, again, all of the opinions of the panelists complement each other, because we have on one side all of these infrastructure projects that took place along the Colorado River, like the Hoover Dam, the Glen Canyon Dam, also the All-American Canal, and also the situations that changed the hydrology of the river, like dams, like the international dams that were built as part of the 1944 treaty. Okay, and also like Samuel said, we have a number of treaties. There's a long history starting with the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, where that have influence that are relevant. All those elements, all of these events are relevant to our subject. We have the 1906 treaty with the waters of in El Paso, Juarez, and that were used only for agriculture. This is a treaty between the two countries. And then the All-American Canal, and of course the 1944 treaty. All of these events took place on the forest, on the forest. And also, like Anita Millman said, there are an increase on the demands on the water of in both basins. And a number of a number of treaties and events, like the minutes the minutes after the 1944 treaty, and the flow laws, and the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan, for instance, and the U.S. Supreme Court cases in Texas and versus New Mexico. All of these taking place in the U.S. All of these, of course, are events that are relevant to the historical evolution of these processes. So all of these questions complement each other. Moving to the question 3, the role of the governments. Well, this is we have some government cooperation, of course, to reach agreements. Of course, an example of this is the SILA IBWC for conflict resolution, the hydro diplomacy that the agency has taken over the last 70 years, and also other institutions like NatBank and the Border Environmental Commission that were created along with NAFTA. Also, we have a lack of emphasis on studies and generation of data, and an issue of environmental justice, like you put it. We have the role of the government. We have this idea, like Samuel Sandoval said, of the whole system that we can talk about on the Rio Grande Basin. A whole system that, despite that there is fragmentation, each actor or each level is doing something to keep the system together. So there is every actor and every institution is doing its work to keep the system working, I would say. In spite of different visions, different systems, political, administrative systems, we have this idea that everybody is working on this. From Anita Millman, of course, there is the federal government on the U.S., the role that has done on different on different activities, like technical assistance, for instance, the support of water-related agreements, the operation of infrastructure, and of course the funding. The role of the government, of the U.S. government in this relationship with Mexico has been one of, strongly oriented also to financing, to take a role in financing not only water improvements, but also in research and other issues like the Endangered Species Act, for instance. What areas?
We need to wrap up now.
Okay,
Just
yeah, okay.
one more comment.
One more comment. Okay, finally, what areas we can think of? More studies and exchange are needed, and holistic and equitable approach is proposed, where both points of view are necessary, both points of view of both countries. Also, a shared basin vision is important, and one very important thing, the local initiatives, where stakeholders are an important resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Luis. Thank you all the panelists for such a rich conversation on this very complex topic as everything that is related to water, but even more when it comes to groundwater. So this was our last session for the day, working session, I mean. Now we have a fun session coming up. So get your drinks, get your kids, get whoever you want to bring in to the happy hour. We're going to give you a couple of minutes. We will be here in no time.